Wyoming Territory, 1885. The unforgiving plains stretched endlessly beneath a vast ceiling of stars, indifferent to the lone figure of Yates Prescott as he sat outside his modest cabin. At 25, he'd already seen enough hardship to last several lifetimes, the harsh lessons of the frontier etched into his otherwise youthful features. Handsome by any measure, with sandy brown hair that fell just above piercing blue eyes, Yates had maintained a lean, muscular build from years of breaking horses and working his small ranch. He stared into the dying embers of his campfire, a familiar emptiness settling in his chest. 3 years since establishing his claim, and all he had to show for it was 15 acres, 22 head of cattle, and a solitude so completed had become both shield and prison. A man needs nothing but his own 2 hands and enough sense to keep to himself, he muttered, repeating the mantra that had carried him through the 5 years since he'd buried his parents after a brutal winter took them both within days of each other. Connections meant vulnerability. Love was a luxury that frontier men couldn't afford, not when starvation, illness, or violence could snatch away anyone at any moment. Better to rely on no one, to need no one. His father had loved his mother desperately, and Yates had watched that love destroy him when she passed. Yet in the quiet moments before sleep claimed him each night, a traitorous thought would surface, that perhaps his small patch of Wyoming earth might someday be more than just land to defend, that it might become a home. Yates shook off the notion as he did every night, retreating to his cabin where only the sound of his own breathing would accompany him till dawn. The town of Clearwater wasn't much to look at, a dusty main street lined with essential businesses and the occasional saloon, but it represented civilization in an otherwise untamed corner of Wyoming Territory. Yates visited only when necessity demanded, which was why he found himself there on a sweltering June afternoon, his wagon loaded with supplies that would carry him through to harvest. "You hear about the auction today?" Old Man Jenkins called out as Yates secured the last of his provisions. "Not interested," Yates replied curtly. He'd learned long ago that town gossip rarely concerned him and was best left unheard. Jenkins chuckled, wiping sweat from his brow. "Might want to make an exception, boy. They're selling off the remaining contracts from that train of mail-order brides that came through. Story goes one lady's intended took one look at her and refused the match. Left her with nothing, not even proper clothes, they say." Yates frowned. "That's hardly my concern." "No, I suppose not," Jenkins said, his weathered face softening. "Just thought with that big cabin of yours sitting empty." "It's not empty. I'm in it," Yates snapped, tipping his hat and climbing onto his wagon before Jenkins could respond. As he guided his horses down the main street, a commotion near the auction house drew his attention despite his determination to mind his own business. A crowd had gathered, their voices raised in a mixture of jeers and callous laughter. Something about the scene made Yates pull his wagon to a halt. Next up, a booming voice called out, one female, age 22. No dowry, no possessions. Contract canceled by intended. Starting bid at $5. Curiosity overcoming his better judgment, Yates approached the edge of the crowd. Through the gaps between onlookers, he caught glimpses of a young woman standing on the auction block. She wore what appeared to be a borrowed dress several sizes too large, cinched at the waist with rope. Her head was bowed, long honey blonde hair falling forward to hide her face, but her posture remained stubbornly straight, dignity intact despite her circumstances. "No takers at 5, the auctioneer called. "Fine then. $3. The crowd's murmuring grew louder, peppered with crude suggestions that made Yates's jaw clench. $2? Surely someone has $2 for a healthy woman. Still, no bids came. Yates could see the woman's hands trembling, though she kept them clasped tightly before her. $1 then. $1 or she'll be turned out with nothing. The silence that followed struck Yates with unexpected force. This woman stood alone in a foreign town, abandoned and humiliated, with no one willing to offer even a single dollar for her contracted labor. In that moment, something in his carefully constructed worldview cracked, a hairline fracture in the belief that isolation was the only path to survival. $10, he heard himself say, the words escaping before he could catch them. All heads turned toward him, including the woman's. For the first time, Yates saw her face, delicate features framed by that honey blonde hair, eyes a startling shade of green, and a small birthmark just below her right cheekbone. But what struck him most was the flash of wary hope in her expression, quickly guarded as though she feared it might be another cruel joke at her expense. "Sold," the auctioneer declared, clearly relieved. "To Prescott for $10. As Yates approached to complete the transaction, the reality of what he'd done crashed over him. He'd just purchased a woman's contract, a stranger he would now be responsible for. Everything he believed about keeping to himself, about the dangers of letting another person into his life, screamed at him to walk away. Instead, he found himself extending a hand to help her down from the platform. "Yates Prescott," he said quietly. "My ranch is about 2 hours' ride from here." She placed her hand in his, her touch light but not fragile. "Faith Winters," she replied, her voice soft but clear. "And I have nowhere else to go, Mr. Prescott. So I suppose your ranch will do just fine." The ride back to the ranch passed in uncomfortable silence. Faith sat beside Yates on the wagon bench, her borrowed dress pooling around her, her entire worldly possessions, a small cloth bundle containing what appeared to be a hairbrush and a faded photograph, clutched in her lap. "I'm not looking for a wife," Yates finally said as his cabin came into view on the horizon. Faith turned to him, a hint of defiance in her gaze. "I wasn't aware I'd offered to be one, Mr. Prescott." The unexpected response caught him off guard. "I just meant the contract. Those women were brought in as mail-order brides." "Yes, and my intended took one look at me and decided I wasn't what he'd ordered," she replied evenly. "He claimed I wasn't pretty enough, though I suspect he simply couldn't afford the full payment and used my appearance as an excuse. Either way, the contract was voided. You've purchased my labor, not my hand." Yates felt a flush of embarrassment. "I've never had help before. Don't know what tasks to give you. I can cook, clean, mend clothes, tend a garden if you have one. I can milk cows and collect eggs. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Prescott." She paused, then added more quietly, "I just need somewhere to start over." As they approached the cabin, Yates noticed Faith assessing the property, the sturdy log structure, the small barn, the beginnings of a vegetable garden he'd half-heartedly planted in spring. "It's not much," he said. "It's more than I had this morning," she replied. Inside the cabin, Yates suddenly saw his home through a stranger's eyes. The sparse furnishings, the lack of any personal touches save for a single photograph of his parents on the mantel. A bed occupied one corner, a table and 2 chairs another. A small stove, some shelves with basic provisions, and a trunk containing his few spare clothes completed the inventory. "You'll take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep by the fire." Faith looked at him, clearly surprised by the offer. "That's hardly necessary. I can make a pallet. You'll take the bed," Yates repeated firmly. "Tomorrow I'll build a partition for privacy." Something in Faith's expression softened slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Prescott." That night, as Yates lay on his bedroll near the dying embers of the fire, he listened to the unfamiliar sound of another person's breathing in his home. Every instinct told him he'd made a terrible mistake, that he should ride her back to town in the morning and find someone else to take her contract. Yet beneath that fear ran a current of something else, a quiet recognition that the cabin felt different with her presence. Not invaded, as he might have expected, but somehow less hollow. Over the following weeks, a cautious rhythm developed between them. Faith proved herself capable and hardworking, transforming the sparse cabin into something that began to resemble a home. Curtains appeared at the windows, fashioned from flour sacks. The garden flourished under her attention. Meals became regular affairs with surprising variety considering their limited provisions. For his part, Yates maintained a careful distance, leaving at dawn to tend the cattle or mend fences, returning only when necessary. He kept conversations brief and practical, determined not to allow any attachment to form. Yet each evening, he found himself lingering longer at the table after supper, sometimes answering Faith's careful questions about the land or offering advice about the harsh Wyoming winters. One evening in late July, a violent thunderstorm swept across the plains. Yates rushed to secure the livestock, Faith working alongside him without being asked, her hair plastered to her face as they led the frightened animals to shelter. "The last calf," Yates shouted over the wind, pointing to a spring-born heifer huddled against the fence line. "I'll get her. I'm closer," Faith called back, already moving toward the terrified animal. Lightning cracked dangerously close, and the calf bolted in panic. Without hesitation, Faith ran after it, skirts hiked up, disappearing into the curtain of rain. Yates followed, heart pounding with an urgency he didn't want to examine. He found them in a shallow gully, Faith kneeling in mud, somehow having managed to calm the calf enough to secure a rope around its neck. She looked up at him, rain streaming down her face, a triumphant smile breaking through her exhaustion. Something shifted in Yates's chest, a recognition that this woman wasn't merely surviving his charity. She was proving herself essential to the life he'd built, filling spaces he hadn't realized were empty. Back at the cabin, both soaked to the bone and shivering, Yates built up the fire while Faith changed behind the partition he'd constructed her first week. "That was foolish," he said when she emerged in her nightdress and robe, hair wrapped in a towel. "Running after the calf like that. Lightning could have struck you." Faith lifted her chin slightly. "The same lightning could have struck you, Mr. Prescott. The calf needed help, and I was there to give it. You could have been hurt. So could you. Every day you ride out alone." She sat in the chair opposite him, regarding him steadily. "Is that why you keep everyone at arm's length? Fear of what might happen?" The directness of her question startled him. "I don't keep everyone at arm's length. Don't you?" Faith challenged gently. "In 7 weeks, I've learned almost nothing about you beyond what I can observe. You've asked nothing about me or my past. We live under the same roof, yet remain strangers. It's simpler that way," Yates said, turning to stare into the fire. "Simpler, perhaps, but lonely." Faith's voice softened. "I know something about loneliness, Mr. Prescott. I was an orphan raised by the church until I was 18. When they could no longer justify keeping me, I was encouraged to answer an advertisement for mail-order brides. I thought perhaps I might finally belong somewhere, to someone." Her honesty hung between them, an offering he wasn't sure he was ready to accept. Yet something compelled him to respond in kind. "My parents died 5 years ago. Winter fever. One day they were planning spring planting. The next—" He shook his head. "My father lasted 3 days after my mother passed. Simply lost the will to continue without her. I decided then that attachment was a weakness I couldn't afford. Or perhaps," Faith said carefully, "your father simply couldn't imagine life without the person who made it worth living." Yates looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw not just the capable woman who had transformed his cabin and helped save his livestock, but someone who understood loss as intimately as he did. "You should call me Yates," he said finally. "If we're to live together, Mr. Prescott seems unnecessarily formal." Faith's smile was warm enough to chase away the last of the evening's chill. "Yates, then. And I'm Faith." That night, as he lay on his bedroll listening to the storm's retreat and Faith's steady breathing, Yates acknowledged that the wall he'd built around himself had begun to crumble, and he wasn't entirely certain he wanted to rebuild it. August brought the brutal heat of high summer, days spent working from dawn until the sun became too punishing, then resuming labor in the marginally cooler evenings. Faith took to rising before Yates, having coffee and a simple breakfast waiting when he emerged from his bedroll. One morning, Yates found the cabin empty, Faith's absence an unexpected hollow in his day. A note on the table explained she'd gone to gather berries she'd spotted on her last walk. Relief mingled with something like disappointment that he wouldn't see her until later. When midday passed with no sign of her return, unease began to gnaw at him. By early afternoon, Yates saddled his horse and set out in the direction she'd indicated in her note, telling himself he was merely being cautious. He found her basket overturned near a thicket of wild berries, its contents scattered across the grass. Faith was nowhere in sight. "Faith," he called, panic rising in his throat. "Faith, where are you?" A weak reply came from beyond the berry bushes. Following the sound, Yates discovered Faith sitting beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree, her face pale, her right ankle swollen to nearly twice its normal size. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I stepped in a gopher hole. Tried to walk back, but couldn't manage it." Relief made Yates's voice sharper than intended. "You should have been more careful." Faith's eyes flashed with unexpected fire. "Yes, how inconsiderate of me to injure myself and inconvenience you." The spark of anger surprised him, but even more surprising was his reaction to it. A strange satisfaction at seeing this proof that Faith was no delicate flower to be coddled, but a woman with spirit enough to stand her ground even when injured. That's not what I meant, he said, kneeling to examine her ankle. I was concerned. Were you? She asked, her voice softening. Yates met her gaze, suddenly aware of how close they were. Yes, he admitted. I was. The ride home was slow, Faith seated in front of Yates, his arms around her to hold the reins. Her back pressed against his chest, her hair carrying the scent of wildflowers and summer heat. The physical proximity awakened sensations Yates had long denied himself, a hunger for connection that went beyond the practical partnership they'd established. At the cabin, he carried her inside despite her protests, setting her gently on her bed before fetching cold water to bathe her injured ankle. As he carefully wrapped the swelling with strips of clean cloth, Faith watched him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. You have gentle hands for a man so determined to be hard, she observed. Yates completed his task without looking up, afraid of what she might read in his eyes. You'll need to stay off this foot for at least a few days. And who will tend the garden? Cook the meals? The work doesn't stop because I've been foolish enough to injure myself. I managed before you came, Yates reminded her, finally meeting her gaze. I can manage again. You survived before I came, Faith corrected softly. There's a difference between surviving and living, Yates. Her words struck with unexpected force, piercing the armor he'd carefully constructed over the years. Had he merely been surviving? Had the walls he built to protect himself from loss also barred him from truly living? That night, Yates prepared a simple stew following Faith's instructions, served with bread she'd baked the previous day. He brought a bowl to where she sat propped up in bed, her ankle elevated on a pillow. It's not as good as yours, he said as he handed her the food. You'll improve with practice, she replied with a small smile. They ate together, Faith in her bed, Yates seated on a chair beside her. The arrangement felt strangely intimate, more so than sharing the table had been. In the soft glow of the oil lamp, with night pressing against the windows, the cabin seemed to shrink around them, creating a world that consisted only of their shared space and quiet conversation. Tell me about your parents, Faith asked. Not how they died, but how they lived. No one had ever asked Yates that question before. He hesitated, then found himself speaking of his mother's talent for coaxing music from a battered piano they'd hauled all the way from Ohio, of his father's knack for finding water where others saw only dry earth. He spoke of their laughter, their occasional fierce arguments that always ended in reconciliation, their unwavering belief in each other. They sound wonderful, Faith said when he finally fell silent. You must miss them terribly. I do, Yates admitted. But speaking of them tonight, it feels good to remember the living, not just the dying. Faith reached out, her fingers brushing his in a touch so light it might have been imagined. Thank you for sharing them with me. Later, as he settled onto his bedroll, Yates realized with startling clarity that for the first time in 5 years, thinking of his parents brought more warmth than pain. And somehow, he knew Faith was responsible for that shift. By September, Faith's presence had become as essential to the ranch as the water from the well or the wood for the stove. Her ankle had healed, though on damp mornings Yates noticed she favored it slightly. The garden yielded a modest harvest under her care, enough to preserve for the coming winter. The cabin itself had transformed, curtains at the windows, a braided rug beside the bed, wildflowers in a jar on the table. More significant were the changes in Yates himself. He found himself hurrying to complete his chores rather than lingering over them to avoid returning to an empty cabin. Conversations with Faith over meals stretched into the evening, sometimes continuing until the fire burned low. He learned of her childhood in the church orphanage, her dreams of someday having a family of her own, her determination to make a life for herself despite the abandonment she'd suffered in Clearwater. In turn, he shared more of himself than he had with anyone since his parents' passing. His hopes for expanding the ranch, his memories of traveling west as a boy, even his fears of failing at the life he was trying to build. The evening air had developed an autumn chill when Yates returned from a trip to Clearwater with supplies, and a surprise he'd been uncertain about purchasing until the last moment. Faith greeted him from the doorway, her smile warming him more effectively than the stove ever could. Was your journey successful? She asked, helping him unload the wagon. Mostly, Yates replied, deliberately keeping one parcel behind his back as they entered the cabin. I have something for you. Faith turned, surprise evident in her expression. For me? Yates extended the package, wrapped in brown paper and string. It's not much. With careful fingers, Faith unwrapped the gift, a dress of deep blue cotton, simple but well made, and beneath it, a book of poetry. Her eyes widened as she lifted the dress, holding it against herself. Yates, it's beautiful. She looked up at him, genuine emotion shining in her eyes. But why? He shifted uncomfortably and used to giving gifts. I noticed your dress is wearing thin. And the book, you mentioned once that you missed reading. Faith touched the fabric with reverent fingers. No one has ever given me something simply because they thought I might like it. She clutched the gifts to her chest. Thank you. The pure joy in her expression struck Yates with the force of revelation. This was what had been missing from his life. Not just companionship or help with chores, but the profound satisfaction of bringing happiness to another person, of matching to someone beyond what he could provide or produce. That night, Faith wore the new dress for supper. The deep blue brought out the gold in her hair and made her eyes appear even more vibrantly green. Yates found himself staring, suddenly aware of her not just as the woman who shared his home, but as a beautiful person who had gradually come to occupy his thoughts even when they were apart. Does it look all right? Faith asked, misinterpreting his silence. You look. Yates paused, searching for the right word. Beautiful. A blush colored her cheeks. That's very kind. It's very true. After supper, they sat before the fire while Faith read aloud from the book of poetry, her voice giving life to words about love and longing, about finding home in another person's heart. Yates watched the firelight play across her features, highlighting the delicate curve of her jaw, the fullness of her lips as they shaped each verse. When she finished a particularly moving poem, she looked up to find him watching her intently. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of the changing nature of their relationship, a question neither was quite ready to ask. It's getting late, Faith said softly, closing the book. We should probably. The moment was shattered by a pounding at the door. Yates rose quickly, hand moving instinctively to the rifle kept beside the entrance. Visitors at night, this far from town, rarely brought good news. He opened the door to find a man he didn't recognize, tall, well-dressed, with an expression that shifted from determination to shock as he took in Yates's appearance. Can I help you? Yates asked, keeping his body positioned to block the stranger's view of Faith. I'm looking for a woman, the man said, his accent marking him as Eastern. Faith Winters. I was told in town she might be here. Behind him, Yates heard Faith's sharp intake of breath. He turned to see her standing rigid, the color drained from her face. Victor, she whispered. The stranger, Victor, pushed past Yates into the cabin, his gaze fixed on Faith. Faith, thank God I've found you. Who are you? Yates demanded, closing the door but keeping his hand on his rifle. Victor Chamberlain, the man replied without looking away from Faith. I was to be Miss Winters's husband. A cold weight settled in Yates's stomach. You're the man who rejected her contract. Victor had the grace to look ashamed. A terrible misunderstanding. I've come to rectify it. Faith had regained her composure, her chin lifting slightly. Misunderstanding? You told the matchmaker I was too plain, too thin, not worth the agreed-upon price. I was a fool, Victor said, taking a step toward her. I'd had a difficult journey, lost most of my funds to thieves along the way. I couldn't afford the contract price and spoke cruelly out of wounded pride. He reached into his coat, producing papers. I've come to honor our original agreement. I'm prepared to pay your current employer for release of your contract, plus additional compensation for his trouble. Yates felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. He looked at Faith, searching her expression for any indication of what she was thinking. Her face remained carefully neutral, but her eyes held confusion, uncertainty, and something that might have been regret. It's late, Yates finally said, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. Whatever decisions need to be made can wait until morning. Mr. Chamberlain, you're welcome to sleep in the barn tonight. Victor looked ready to protest, but seemed to think better of it. Very well. We'll discuss terms in the morning. He turned to Faith, his expression softening. I truly am sorry, Miss Winters. I hope you'll give me the chance to make amends. After showing Victor to the barn, Yates returned to find Faith standing exactly where he'd left her, her hands clutched tightly together. "Did you know he would come for you?" Yates asked, the question emerging more harshly than intended. Faith shook her head. "No, I never imagined." She trailed off, then looked at him directly. "What are you going to do?" It was the wrong question, or perhaps the perfect one, revealing the power dynamic that still existed between them despite the closeness that had grown. Her contract belonged to him. Legally, he could refuse to release it regardless of her wishes. "The question," Yates said carefully, "is what do you want to do?" Faith's eyes widened slightly. "You would give me the choice? Your contract was for labor, not marriage. You've more than fulfilled that obligation." Yates struggled to keep his voice level. "If you wish to go with him, I won't stop you." The words cost him more than he'd expected. The thought of Faith leaving, of returning to the empty existence he'd known before her arrival, created a physical ache in his chest. "I need to think," Faith said quietly. "This is unexpected." Yates nodded, unable to trust his voice further. He watched as she retreated behind the partition to her bed. The blue dress he'd given her a painful reminder of how briefly happiness could last on the frontier. That night, Yates didn't sleep. He sat before the dying fire, replaying every moment shared with Faith, recognizing too late what had been growing between them, or perhaps what had grown only on his side, while for her, he remained merely the man who had purchased her contract when no one else would. Dawn broke with dismal gray light seeping through the windows. Yates had already prepared coffee when Faith emerged from behind her partition, her face showing signs of a similarly sleepless night. "He's still here," Yates said, nodding toward the barn. "I checked." Faith accepted the coffee he offered. "What did you expect? That he would disappear like morning mist?" "I had hoped," Yates admitted, attempting a smile that didn't reach his eyes. They sat in uncomfortable silence until a knock at the door announced Victor's arrival. The man appeared well-rested and determined, hat in hand, as he entered the cabin. "Good morning," he said, nodding to Faith before turning to Yates. "I believe we have business to discuss, Mr. Prescott." Yates gestured to the table. "Miss Winters and I were just about to have that conversation ourselves." Victor looked between them, clearly expecting to be included. When neither invited him to sit, he remained standing awkwardly near the door. "Faith," Yates said, forcing himself to meet her gaze directly. "Your contract with me is fulfilled. You're free to choose your own path forward." Victor stepped forward eagerly. "Faith, I know my behavior in Clearwater was unforgivable, but I've spent months searching for you, determined to make amends. I have a good position waiting in Denver, a real house, servants, all the comforts a woman could want." "And what would be my role in this house?" Faith asked, her voice steady. "My wife, of course," Victor replied. "The match was arranged before my lapse in judgment. The offer still stands." Faith turned to Yates. "And you? What do you offer?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. Victor was offering security, comfort, social standing. Everything a woman in Faith's position might reasonably desire. What could he possibly counter with? "This," Yates said simply, gesturing to the modest cabin around them. "Hard work. Cold winters. A small ranch that may or may not thrive." He paused, gathering courage for words he'd never expected to speak. "And a man who has come to care for you more than he thought possible. Who finds that the walls he built to keep the world out have somehow allowed you in." Faith's eyes widened, a flush spreading across her cheeks. "Yates, I don't have fine things to offer," he continued, the words coming faster now. "But I can promise that you would never be seen as a contract or an obligation. You would be a partner, equal in all things." Victor made a dismissive sound. "Romantic notions don't keep a woman in proper clothes or put food on the table." "Perhaps not," Faith said, her gaze never leaving Yates's face. "But they can sustain the spirit through hardships that would break a loveless union." Hope flared in Yates's chest, fragile but insistent. "Are you saying—" A thunderous crash interrupted him as the door burst open. 3 men stood in the doorway, guns drawn, faces set in grim determination. "Victor Chamberlain," the lead man said, "you're wanted for fraud and theft in Colorado Territory." Victor's face drained of color. "This is a mistake." "No mistake," the man replied, producing a wanted poster that clearly displayed Victor's likeness. "You've been swindling your way across 3 territories, courting women under false pretenses and robbing them blind." Faith gasped, a hand going to her throat. Is this true? Victor's expression hardened, the mask of gentility slipping to reveal something colder beneath. You should be grateful I left you in clear water. The others weren't so fortunate. As the lawman moved to restrain Victor, he made a desperate lunge toward Faith. Without thinking, Yates threw himself between them, taking the full force of Victor's attack. They crashed to the floor, Victor's hands clawing for Yates's throat. Despite the surprise of the assault, Yates managed to throw Victor off balance, pinning him until the lawman could secure him. You all right, son? One of the men asked as they hauled Victor to his feet. Yates nodded, breathing heavily. Take him away from here. As they dragged Victor out, he shouted back at Faith. You think he wants you? He only bought you because he pitied you. No one else would even bid $1. The door slammed behind them, leaving an echo of those cruel words hanging in the cabin. Yates turned to Faith, finding her standing rigidly, arms wrapped around herself as though for protection. Faith, is it true? She asked quietly. Did you buy my contract out of pity? Yates approached her slowly. I bought it because I couldn't bear to see you humiliated. Because something about your dignity in the face of such cruelty spoke to me. He took her hands gently in his. But I asked you to stay because these past months have shown me that a life without you would be empty in ways I never recognized before you came. Faith's eyes filled with tears. When Victor appeared last night, I thought perhaps it was a sign that I should take the comfortable life he offered, the security any woman would want. She shook her head. But as I lay awake, all I could think about was this cabin, this land, the life we've begun to build. Her voice softened. The man who has shown me what it means to belong somewhere. Faith, Yates said, his voice rough with emotion, I love you. Not as a contract, not as help around the ranch. I love your strength, your kindness, your stubborn determination to create beauty even in this harsh place. He lifted a hand to brush a tear from her cheek. I never want to imagine this home without you in it. Then don't, Faith whispered, leaning into his touch. Because I love you too, Yates Prescott. More than I thought possible when you first brought me to this lonely cabin. Yates drew her closer, his heart pounding as their lips met in a kiss that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. Faith's arms wound around his neck, her body fitting perfectly against his, as though they had always been meant to find each other. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, Yates pressed his forehead to hers. Marry me, he said, not because of a contract or obligation, but because we choose each other, every day, above all others. Faith's smile was radiant. Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it. The hard work, the cold winters, the small ranch that may or may not thrive. And yes to the man who saw value in me when no one else would. Clearwater, Wyoming Territory, spring 1886. The small church was filled with the few neighbors who had become friends over the winter months, plus various townspeople curious about the couple whose unusual beginning had become something of a local legend. Faith stood before the altar in a simple white dress, her honey-blonde hair adorned with wildflowers gathered that morning. At 23, her beauty had only deepened with happiness and purpose, her green eyes bright with emotion as she faced the man who had transformed her life. Yates, handsome in his best shirt and new waistcoat, looked at his bride with undisguised adoration. At 26, he had shed the hardened shell of isolation, allowing himself to embrace not just Faith but the community they were building around their ranch. I, Faith Winters, take you, Yates Prescott, to be my lawfully wedded husband, she said, her voice steady and clear. I promise to stand beside you through prosperity and hardship, to share in your burdens and your joys, to make our house a home and our land a legacy. As Yates repeated his vows, his thoughts flashed back to that summer day at the auction block, how close he had come to riding past, to missing the woman who would become essential to his very existence. One small decision, made almost against his will, had altered the course of his life completely. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the preacher declared. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Their kiss was met with cheers and applause, a celebration of not just their union, but the triumph of love over the harsh realities of frontier life. As they walked back down the aisle, Yates caught Faith's hand in his, squeezing gently. No regrets, he asked quietly. Faith's smile was answer enough, but she leaned close to whisper, Only that we wasted so many nights with you sleeping by the fire when you could have been beside me." Laughter bubbled up from Yates's chest, free and unrestrained in a way he once would have thought impossible. "We have a lifetime to make up for that," he promised. Outside the church, spring sunshine bathed the small town in golden light. Their wagon waited, decorated with ribbons and flowers by neighboring women who had taken Faith under their wing during the winter months. The small ranch had already begun to expand. A new barn raised with the help of neighbors, additional acres purchased with the proceeds of a successful cattle sale, a proper garden plot cleared and ready for planting. As Yates helped Faith into the wagon, he was struck by how much had changed in less than a year. The man who had believed isolation was the only path to survival now found himself surrounded by friends, married to a woman who had taught him that true strength lay in connection rather than detachment. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Prescott?" he asked, settling beside her on the wagon seat. Faith leaned against his shoulder, her presence as natural and necessary as breath itself. "I've been home since the day you brought me there, Yates. Today just makes it official." As they drove away from town toward the future they would build together, Yates reflected on the false belief that had nearly cost him everything worth having. That love was a luxury frontier men couldn't afford. In truth, he now understood, love was the very foundation that made the hardships of frontier life not just bearable, but meaningful. Faith's hand found his on the reins, her wedding band catching the sunlight. "What are you thinking about with such a serious expression?" Yates smiled, lifting her hand to press a kiss to her palm. "How fortunate I am that no one else would buy you at that auction." "How fortunate I am that you did," Faith replied softly. "Though I think we both know now that you didn't buy me at all." "No," Yates agreed, his heart full as they crested the rise that would bring their ranch into view. "I think we found each other, exactly when we needed to most." Ahead lay their home, no longer just a cabin on a struggling ranch, but the center of a life built on shared labor, mutual respect, and a love that had conquered the isolation of the Wyoming frontier. Together they had proven that even in the harshest wilderness, the human heart could not only survive but flourish, finding in another person the courage, strength, and joy that transformed mere existence into a life truly worth living.